Benvenuti! Welcome to another podcast from the Italian American Museum of DC. Our programs focus on the contributions of Italians and Italian Americans to the United States in celebration of this year's 250th anniversary of our nation's independence. I am your host, Donna De Sanctis, who is grateful for the invaluable assistance of our podcast producer, Giovanni Sciannameo, and the museum's program manager, Claudio Bonacorsi. Today, we will learn about Carlo Bellini, the first professor of modern language in the United States. He was appointed to the College of William and Mary in 1779 during the American Revolutionary War, making him a pioneering figure in American higher education. Here to tell us more about Bellini and his life is Professor Sergio Ferrarese. He is Associate Professor of Italian Studies and Director of European Studies Program at the College of William and Mary. He teaches courses in Italian cultural history, critical theory, cultural studies, literature, and cinema. His research and publications address a wide range of topics in Italian cultural history, literature, and film. We are honored to have him as our guest here today. Benvenuto, professore.
Grazie. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to talk about Bellini. I've been curious about him for a long time, and I was genuinely grateful for the chance, almost the excuse, to look more closely at this fascinating, almost elusive figure. Allow me also to say that without Bellini, I wouldn't be a professor at William and Mary because he laid the groundwork for the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures.
Well, tell us something about Bellini. Where was he from, and what was his education like?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what is certain about his life in Italy, and then I'm going to answer your question about the education. So what makes Carlo Bellini so intriguing is that he seems to stand at the intersection of several worlds: aristocratic Florence, Enlightenment politics, revolutionary Virginia, and the early history of modern language teaching in America. So let's start by saying what is certain about Bellini. We know that he was born in Florence in 1735, as you pointed out, and into a family of noble descent, and began his career in the tax office of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. But Bellini was not simply a bureaucrat, and for sure he wasn't a devout subject of the Duke of Tuscany. In fact, he appears to have embraced liberal, progressive, republican, perhaps even anti-monarchical ideas, and those beliefs made him politically suspect. In fact, at some point that led to his exile in Paris. We don't know exactly when. And there in the French capital, Bellini spent several years and learned how to speak French before eventually returning to Florence. But even then, the shadow of his political reputation seems to have followed him, so he was always under the scrutiny of the authorities of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. So it seems that Bellini could no longer endure the pressure of constant surveillance, and life in Florence was becoming increasingly difficult. He also faced financial problems. So what happens next? Well, Bellini decides in 1774, at the age of 39, so no longer in his prime, to cross the Atlantic with his wife, and eventually they arrived in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia. That move placed them in a completely different historical context. The world of Jefferson, Williamsburg at the time was the capital, and the American Revolution. So through his friendship with Thomas Jefferson, Bellini was appointed in 1779 as the first professor of modern languages at the College of William and Mary. And this was an extraordinary distinction because it made him the first chair of modern languages, the first professor of modern languages in Northern America. He was also asked to serve as college librarian. So Bellini occupied this unusual double role. He was teacher of language, custodian of books, and in a way, he was also guardian of knowledge when the world around him was violently being, remade.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting things that we learn about him occurred during the Yorktown campaign. So what happened? British troops were advancing, and everyone in Williamsburg, including the faculty, well, they all left. They all left the town. But Bellini and his wife stayed behind in the college's main building, the famous Wren building. So you can imagine this Italian academic, far from Florence, left alone with his wife to guard the library in what is now the oldest academic building in the United States. All the while, war raged around them. So during the period, the college's original charter, dating 1693, was lost or maybe even destroyed under Bellini's watch. And as a librarian, Bellini was supposed to be the protector of the charter. So no one knows to this day what happened to the charter, but one scholarly article suggests that the last person connected to it was Fyodor Kardzavin, or Theodore Kardziavin. I found his name spelled differently in two different sources. Who was this person? It was a Russian merchant and traveler who knew Bellini and was in Williamsburg during the Yorktown campaign. So after this episode, Bellini continued teaching until 1803, just 1 year before his death. He died without a will, and unfortunately was buried in an unknown location, which somehow feels fitting given that parts of his life are still rather obscure. In fact, we know nothing about his education. I mean, nothing is certain, as no documents or evidentiary sources have been provided in biographical account of his life. We can try to reconstruct his education and formative years if we return to Florence. As I said, Bellini was born into a wealthy family, and from this very basic fact, we can make some educated guesses. There were two educational venues that were available for young men of his status in 18th century Florence. So one possibility is that he was educated by the Jesuits. So their educational system, the famous Ratio Studiorum, was highly structured and deeply classical. So a student would have spent a great deal of time on Latin, ancient Greek, rhetoric, philosophy, theology. So the Jesuits imparted the kind of training that gave an elite Catholic gentleman intellectual polish, and how should I put this, social authority. So that type of training was certainly an option for someone from Bellini's background. But there is another possibility that, in my opinion, may fit Bellini even better. The Pierists, or the Scolopi fathers. The Scolopi were an order founded in Spain in the 17th century, and they were really devoted to pedagogy. And so they also educated boys from upper-class families in Florence, but their curriculum tended to be a little bit more practical and modern. So along with the classics, they placed more emphasis on mathematics, geography, science, and especially practical knowledge. And I think this is more likely because Bellini later worked in the administration of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, So if we think of him in a government office dealing with taxes, records, papers, and regulations, then the practical kind of education makes a lot of sense. He would have prepared the young Bellini not only to be cultivated, but also to be precise, organized, and useful in the machinery of government. But we should also not forget that education, he may have received education at home because his education was probably not just one school or one classroom. It was probably a whole environment forming around him. So he may have had tutors. He may already have studied Latin, grammar, classical authors, moral philosophy, and perhaps even rudiments of French, some French, before he ever entered a formal classroom. There is also his exile in Paris. This is an important point too, about his education, where we can safely assume that he learned to speak French with some fluency. So we're not talking about education in a formal sense. Paris gave Bellini the chance to communicate in French every day. We can't surmise that he had studied the language as part of his formal education, but he would have learned to speak it in Paris. So I would like to conclude my answer, and I will put it this way. Bellini's education was probably elite, classical, and practical, but it was still partly hidden from us. It's still partly hidden from us. We can name his school with certainty. We cannot point to a diploma. We can't confidently list his degrees. We don't even know whether he received a university degree. And this gap is in his early life would need to be researched, would need to be reassessed.
You know, it's interesting, Professor, because the trajectory of Bellini's life is very similar to that of Filippo Mazzei, who was also a Tuscan. I believe he was born near Florence. He also crossed swords with the Grand Duke. He also had these anti-monarchical
Yeah.
Ideas favoring the Republican form of government, and came to the United States, or the colonies at that time, for very similar reasons, hoping to find a better life and a little more personal freedom. But I'm curious, Professor, how did Bellini learn enough English in order to be able to teach? Do we know anything about how he acquired the language?
We don't know much. All we have are letters that he sent to Jefferson, and those letters were written in Italian. So there have been suggestions that Bellini, because of these letters, didn't learn how to communicate in English, but I think that sort of bold claim is quite laughable, because you can't spend a good time of your life in a place where spoken English is used without knowing it.
That's true, and since he spoke fluent French and fluent Italian, it really it's well known that someone who is bilingual becomes trilingual a lot faster. So it's likely, as you say, he picked up English from the colonies.
And he was probably gifted for learning languages. So I'm sure he spoke English.
Yes. Well, you know, this is interesting, Professor, since there's so little documentary evidence about him, it has to be quite challenging to research him. What hurdles did you find you have to overcome?
There are several biographical assessments, and many of these assessments make many claims, but those claims are unsubstantiated. That means that there's no document cited in these biographical profiles of Bellini. So an early biographical profile written in the 1920s claimed that he traveled all over Europe, and then he went to the university, but then he had to stop because he had to help his father, who was a merchant. So he had to help him with his business. Also, these early biographical accounts say that he knew German really well and he knew Spanish really well. But again, without proper documentations, without evidentiary evidence, all these claims are basically, are not belong to the conjectural world.
Yeah. Yes. Well, Jefferson knew Italian. Is there the possibility that he was learning Italian from Bellini?
That's a possibility that I considered. Jefferson taught himself Italian, and he could read it very well. And he didn't start from, a simple book like we start teaching language today. He approached, Italian by reading classics of the literature, and even writings by Palladio or Alberti. So in as far as architecture is concerned, he knew Dante, he read Ariosto. I mean, I could spend an hour, probably an expert could spend even more, talking about the Italian library of Jefferson. So it is possible that the epistolary exchange between Bellini and Jefferson, was conceived like a way for Jefferson to read Italian and learn more, maybe about modern Italian. And so I see that also as a sign of friendship between the two and confidence. And so I think your hypothesis makes a lot of sense.
Well, Professor, do we know how Jefferson and Bellini actually met?
We know that when Bellini arrived to the United States, to Virginia, to the colony of Virginia in 1774, they came on a ship that Mazzei sent back to Livorno. And I know that you devoted a very interesting podcast to the figure of Mazzei, because he wanted to bring back laborers and equipment to start the wine business along with Jefferson, as well as some other agricultural venture. The Silk War, now it came back to my mind. And it's probably through Mazzei that Bellini met with Jefferson the first time.
Yeah, that seems very likely. So, what do you think prompted Jefferson first to institute a Department of Modern Languages and then to appoint Bellini at the College of William and Mary?
Well, I think that Jefferson wanted to break with the tradition of classical learning. He probably, he carried out reforms, and these reforms in his alma mater, William and Mary, once he became a prominent figure, the most influential amongst the members of the board of visitors. His reforms wanted to eliminate the Anglican base instruction. In fact, there were laymen and clergymen whose faith was that of the Church of England. And so the idea was to basically create a more secular institution an institution that was open to the modern world. And so teaching modern languages also Jefferson was looking ahead to the creation of what then became the United States. So learning foreign languages, modern languages, made sense because eventually the United States in the future would have had to deal with diplomacy and also trade with other nations worldwide.
Yes, he was really a visionary, wasn't he, Jefferson?
It was.
Well, there's another Italian who introduced Italian studies in the United States, Lorenzo da Ponte, who was Mozart's librettist. And he was the first to teach Italian at Columbia College, which later became Columbia University. But Lorenzo da Ponte is much better well known than Bellini. What could be done to even the playing field? What would be some of your suggestions for what might help?
I think that the figure of Bellini must be reevaluated completely. So I started working 20 years ago at William & Mary, and I heard a lot of things about Bellini. But when I prepared this podcast, I started delving into the subject, and I found a lot of things that were inconsistent, and a lot of information that was inaccurate. So I think we need to produce a biography, with evidence, and that would require some time. But I think it would be very beneficial to the figure of Bellini, as to why we should remember. Sure, we should remember him because he was the first chair and professor of modern languages. We knew that he taught Italian and French. He probably taught some Spanish, even though I'm pretty certain he didn't know how to speak it. And the same goes for German. And if this type of intellectual undertaking should take shape, I think it should take also into consideration the fact that Bellini found in Virginia what he had dreamt of when he was in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. So basically, he found himself totally in tune with the idea of creating a republic instead of being dependent and to be ordered by a monarch, by a tyrant.
Did he ever become an American citizen the way Mazzei did?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
So it sounds like there aren't any books written about Bellini. Is he even mentioned when historians talk about the early years of the American Republic?
It is mentioned by historians, but very briefly, and all we know is kind of this perpetuation of bold claims, right, that were not substantiated by evidence.
Any chance you're thinking of writing that biography, Professor?
Oh, it could be possible, perhaps at the end of my career. Why not? It would be an interesting experience.
Well, in conclusion, Professor, I'd like to know first, what is from the studies you've been doing so far, what's your impression of Bellini as not just as a teacher, but also as a man? And how do you think he should be remembered today?
Well, he was a very likable man. He was very warm. In fact, I want to go back to the epistolary with Jefferson. For instance, he would address Jefferson as my dearest Thomas, mio carissimo Tommaso, or mio Tommaso amatissimo, my beloved Thomas, right? Whereas Jefferson would write back, dear sir. So from here we can infer he was a very warm and very easygoing character, right? I think, and then to answer your question, I think Bellini should be remembered for what he has been. So the first, modern chair of modern languages and first professor of French and Italian. But I would also, say that his life in Virginia was deeply, deeply connected because he believed with the revolutionary environment. In fact, he also occupied a specific office in the government of Virginia because he had already acquired expertise while he was working in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And so I would like Bellini to be remembered as someone who took part, even a small part, in the making of the country.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. We have been speaking with Professor Sergio Ferrarese, talking about Carlo Bellini, the first teacher of modern languages in the United States. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Professor, for this very enlightening introduction to Carlo Bellini.
Thank you very much.